Happy belated Earth Day, everybody. And to those of you joining us for the first time, welcome to the Fire Drill Fridays family, where we're building community, learning about the climate crisis, and taking action to address it. You know that each of you can help our movement grow by sharing today's show so that your friends and colleagues can join the movement. So do it. Take a moment now and hit share. There's a button, share. The more people who understand the gravity of the potential climate catastrophe and are willing to act, the more chance we have to minimize it. You know, things are going to get worse than they are now, no matter what, because of all the heat baked in, but we want to minimize it. So please help people to join our movement. And next week is our second movie night. I mean, what happened to all that time in between the last one? It's just gone so fast. Anyway, I'm pretty excited because on April 29th, remember, it's always the last Thursday of the month, April 29th at 5 p.m. Pacific time, we're going to be showing a really special pre-released viewing of Youth v. Gov. This has not been released yet. It's the story of America's youth taking on the world's most powerful government. Since 2015, 21 plaintiffs, now ages 13 to 24, have been suing the US government for violating their constitutional rights to life, liberty, personal safety, and property through their willful actions in creating the climate crisis that they're going to inherit. But Youth v. Gov is about more than just a lawsuit. It's a story of empowered youth finding their voices and fighting to protect their rights and our collective future. And to get ready, I need your help. Put your favorite drink recipe in the chat now, and we'll pick one to feature next week, okay? We're going to kick off with making a movie night drink and some popcorn. I like popcorn. And then we're going to watch the film together. And after the show, I'll be joined by Phil Gregory, the lead counsel on the case. We're going to have a Q&A. So visit firedrillfridays.com/movie night to sign up. All right, we have a lot to talk about today. Biden's climate summit, yesterday's hearing on ending fossil fuel subsidies, and the nitty-gritty on the End Polluter Welfare Act. But before we get into it, you know the drill. Let's have some good news. And the good news today is, as the world's most powerful leaders prepare to come together for President Biden's virtual climate summit, which they started yesterday, the Dalai Lama and 100 other Nobel Prize winners have a clear message for them. Keep fossil fuels in the ground. They've written to President Biden and everybody that's attending the summit, urging them to take concrete steps to phase out fossil fuels in order to prevent catastrophic climate change. Quote, "The burning of fossil fuels is responsible for almost 80% of carbon dioxide emissions since the Industrial Revolution," the letter says. And it goes on, quote, "Allowing the continued expansion of this industry is unconscionable," unquote. The signatories make it clear they believe it's up to the summit's attendees to act. They say, the letter says, leaders, not industry, hold the power and have the moral responsibility to take bold actions to address this climate, unquote. Okay, so let's talk about the summit. President Biden's two-day climate summit, which kicked off yesterday, Earth Day, and he's virtually hosting 40 world leaders to discuss the urgency around the climate crisis and the economic benefits of acting swiftly to combat the crisis. President Biden has already signaled his commitment to fighting climate change by rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement on his first day in office. But this climate summit will let us know how seriously he is about reducing US greenhouse gas emissions. It's so important that we stay vigilant and understand that there's a big difference between access and influence. We need to keep pushing the administration to do what's necessary to tackle the climate crisis. Yesterday also marked a very important hearing on ending fossil fuel subsidies. You know, climate scientists say that we have to set a target that would cut US greenhouse gas emissions by at least 50% below the 2005 levels by 2030, in less than a decade. Just ahead of the summit start, Biden announced that he'll set a target for the US to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50 to 52% by 2030. And it's a good start. It's a really good start. But Fire Drill Fridays and Greenpeace are calling on the president to up that percentage to 70 degrees. Other countries can cut theirs by 50%, but we have the capital, we have the technology, we are perfectly situated. We have the wherewithal to go beyond 50%. So we're calling on the administration to cut 70% of our carbon emissions in order to get us on track for eventual zero emissions by 2050. We're going to be watching what happens and sharing insights next week when we have a look back at Biden's first 100 days. You know, it's important that we stay vigilant and understand that there's a big difference, as I said, between access and influence. We need to keep pushing the administration to do what's necessary. Yesterday also marked a very important hearing on ending fossil fuel subsidies. Representative Ro Khanna of California hosted the hearing, and testimonies were heard from Tara Houska. She was a guest here on Fire Drill Fridays talking about Line 3. She was one of the indigenous women who invited me up to northern Minnesota to call attention to Line 3. And Greta Thunberg. In Greta's testimony, she said, quote, "The fact that we're still having this discussion, and even more that we're still subsidizing fossil fuels directly or indirectly using taxpayers' money is a disgrace," unquote. The momentum to get rid of all fossil fuel subsidies, not just the bit in Biden's tax plan, is growing. It's really growing, and we have to keep up the pressure. Ending fossil fuel subsidies is the first step to ending the era of fossil fuels, and it's our main focus right now. So if someone asks you what we want on Fire Drill Fridays, you tell them, plain and simple, no more fossil fuel subsidies. Not another dime of our tax dollars should go to corporations that poison Black and brown communities and destroy our climate. You know that 2.8 million people have died so far from COVID over the last 15 months, but over the same 15 months, 8.7 million, 3 times as many, have died from fossil fuel related air pollution. We want to continue giving these people money? I don't think so. It's time for our government to divest from systems of exploitation and extraction and begin investing in community health and well-being. We want these absurd corporate handouts eliminated entirely. Biden needs to stay true to his campaign promises and make it happen. So today we're going to hear from 2 wonderful guests about this week's important events. Jennifer Morgan is Greenpeace International's executive director. She's going to offer some international context and insights into Biden's summit and how his climate commitments are being viewed outside the US. Our other guest, Collin Rees from Oil Change International, is joining us to bring things back into a domestic framework and what Biden needs to commit to here, such as ending fossil fuel subsidies. Join me in welcoming Jennifer Morgan back to Fire Drill Fridays. Jennifer is a leading expert on climate issues and civil society advocacy. She was voted by Apolitical as one of the world's top 20 most influential people in climate policy. Morgan is currently the executive director of Greenpeace International, as well as managing the organization. Jennifer is a public figure who represents Greenpeace in the media, at other events ranging from UNFCCC meetings and the World Economic Forum to strikes, marches, and rallies around the world. Collin Rees is also no stranger to Fire Drill Fridays. He is senior campaigner at Oil Change International, working to stop big oil's expansion, support grassroots resistance, and end public support for oil, gas, and coal with a just transition. He's campaigned on climate and racial justice for the last decade with groups like Power Shift Network, 350.org, Demand Climate Justice, and he's a board member of the Youth Climate Justice Group, Sustain US. He lives in Portland, Maine. And thanks very much to both of you, Jennifer and Collin, for taking time to join us today. Welcome. Jennifer, let me start with you. As head of a global environmental organization, why does it matter so much what Biden does?
Well, first of all, it's great to be here with you, Jane, and with Collin. And it matters what Biden does because the U.S. is the world's largest historical greenhouse gas polluter. It's number 2 now, if you just look at today's emissions, but the biggest historical polluter. It's also about the whole reach of the U.S., the corporates that are there. If you think about, since Paris, there's been $3.8 trillion US invested by 60 banks into the fossil fuel industry. The majority of those are in the US. It's about the extractive industries that in the north, in the US, that pull up and exploit people in other countries. It's about American culture that just has such a dominant, not still, but pretty dominant influence around the world. So because of both, I would say the corporate influence, the historical and current emissions, and just the way that the world works around trade and American culture, it matters. It matters a lot.
I was just stunned yesterday to learn that Chevron supports the junta, the bad guys in Myanmar, in Burma, and they are lobbying the US government to stop any sanctions against those dictators. I can't believe it. Chevron.
I'm not surprised. I mean, if you look back, the first report was on the desk of Lyndon B. Johnson on the science. And then you look at the efforts that Exxon knew and Chevron and all of these companies that have worked so hard over the years to have that grip on the economy and how it's run. And this is what we're trying to break. It's that system of systemic, destruction of nature, racism, and patriarchy. I'd put those all together.
All together, and the backing up of tyrants in other countries. Collin, what can President Biden and Congress do in the US to follow through with their global commitments to boldly tackle climate change?
Thank you, Jane. First off, I just want to say it's so good to be here with you and Jennifer and to see all these great people on today. I think this is the key question in the US at the moment. Is there's a lot of great talk that's been happening on the campaign trail as Biden was inaugurated during yesterday's summit. And now the big question is, where's the action? What does it look like? We got some initial strides toward that yesterday, but I think the big question that I know a lot of us are fighting for and that we didn't hear a lot about yesterday are, what are we going to do about stopping the support of the fossil fuel industry? How are we going to actively tackle the fossil fuel industry as we work to confront the climate crisis? The cutting emissions, that's a very important part. We need to do even more than we said yesterday, but there's so much that needs to be done, and it has to be done nearly all at once. I think the most important thing to remember is that you can't claim to be a climate leader without standing up to the fossil fuel industry. And so here in the States, that means ending subsidies to fossil fuel producers. It means cutting off the flows of finance to the fossil fuel industry. That's both public finance and private finance, as Jennifer talked about, through the banks. And it means stopping fossil fuel expansion. So any presidential permit, anything at the federal level, these are permits that Biden needs to be denying. We need to be stopping the approval of new pipelines like the Line 3 pipeline that Tara was talking about on Fire Drill Fridays earlier and yesterday. And we need to be doing all of that with a just transition for workers, ensuring that we are taking care of our people and of our most exploited communities, the most oppressed communities who are suffering first and worst from the impacts of the climate crisis. So those are the things that we need to do. Subsidies are such a key piece of this. And to just tie it back to what you were talking about, subsidies and the political benefit that they convey are such an important part of keeping companies like Chevron, like Exxon, like Marathon Petroleum, keeping them in the public eye, keeping them going. The subsidies are such a key piece of that. So when we're talking about removing subsidies, it's not just the fiscal benefit of that, it's also so much the political benefit of taking away government support for this industry.
Right, right. Jennifer, what are your thoughts and reactions to Biden administration's new Paris goals that were announced this week?
Yeah, well, as you said, I mean, it's a good start. I mean, having emissions in 9 years will take a big effort, but it's not leadership to the level that we need right now, based on either the science or on equity. I mean, if you look at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and what it's saying we need to do globally to stay below, with not cross that 1.5 degree threshold of warming, it means a halving of global emissions by 2030. And that means developed countries, wealthy countries that have the resources of the United States need to do more than that. And you mentioned the number 70% by 2030. And that is the number that Greenpeace and many organizations around the world have been calling on from the Biden administration. I think the other thing which Collin mentioned that I think we were very disappointed in was there was no detail. There was nothing about the fossil fuel subsidies. There was nothing about, those measures that they need to put in place. And that's what's going to build the credibility, right? I mean, the US has come and gone from international agreements twice. I've experienced it twice, Kyoto Protocol and Paris. I don't want to see it again. That's enough. But it means that the implementation measures that get put in place are just totally fundamental. Because without that, the US just doesn't have the level of credibility. And because of the high per capita emissions of the US and the historical responsibility, it needs to do more than 50. And it can.
Don't just flesh out what you mean when you say the implementation measures. What do you mean?
Sure. So things like, doing away with fossil fuel subsidies, things like no longer allowing drilling on public lands, things like no longer giving permits for new fossil infrastructure, as well as, many of the things in the Green New Deal, which are also needed. So how we actually go to, Biden has put forward a carbon-free power sector by 2035. That needs to be with renewable energy. So let's get a clean energy standard that has renewable energy in it. Let's get our mobility system such that we have very, efficient zero emission cars, but from renewables, and mobility systems that can get people to school and to work affordably. Those are the types of measures across the board that can get you there, that are good for so many reasons, not only the climate, but for the climate, they're fundamental.
Thanks. Collin, what is End Polluter Welfare Act? What does it do? And why is it important to pass that in order to tackle fossil fuel subsidies?
It's a great question. Thanks, Jane. So the End Polluter Welfare Act is essentially the gold standard for legislation to remove fossil fuel subsidies and public support for the fossil fuel industry here in the United States. The End Polluter Welfare Act identifies dozens of different tax breaks, loopholes, different ways in which the government is supporting the fossil fuel industry. As some people have mentioned in the chat, some of that is related to the fossil fuel leasing program as well. We need to end all of this public support for the fossil fuel industry. So the End Polluter Welfare Act is quite a long bill. It's not easy to read, but that's because this is about the minutia of the tax code. It's about fossil fuel lobbyists who've gone in over the last over 100 years and continuously tweaked and changed the tax code so they're not paying taxes like you and I do. They are specifically exploiting these to not pay taxes, to offshore their profits, to get billions in profits, extra profits from the government due to these tax loopholes and subsidies. And so the End Polluter Welfare Act closes most of those loopholes. It says you can't have this anymore. You can't have this special treatment. And it also goes further and says we aren't going to put subsidies in place in the future. We aren't going to be incentivizing dangerous false solutions like carbon capture and storage, and this idea that fossil fuels continue as long as we can just suck carbon out of the air. I think that's something we're seeing come up more and more in discussions at the summit. Maybe Jennifer can speak to it, but that idea that fossil fuels can continue, but just in a different form, or fossil fuels, if only we can suck the carbon away. I think that's a really dangerous one, and one we're seeing come up a lot. So the Polluter Welfare Act, which was just reintroduced last week by Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont and Representative Ilhan Omar of Minnesota, along with several other co-sponsors, gets rid of all of those subsidies. It also ends public finance for fossil fuels. Right now, a couple of US government institutions are sending billions of dollars overseas to help US companies build fossil fuel projects in other places. And the multilateral development banks, things like the World Bank, these major global institutions are still funding tens of billions of dollars of fossil fuels and fossil fuel projects, mostly in the developing world, every year. The Polluter Welfare Act would start to change that, would cut off those flows of finance as well. And so because it's so comprehensive, that's the best thing about the Polluter Welfare Act. You'll see a lot of politicians talk about the need to end subsidies, but then only talk about one or two pieces. Polluter Welfare Act is basically the full list of all the subsidies that need to be removed. It gets rid of them, and it makes sure that we're not supporting the fossil fuel industry's expansion going forward.
And do you think, can the Senate pass it through budget reconciliation? I mean, seems like it clearly affects the budget in order to avoid the filibuster.
Absolutely, yeah. Of course, we need to remove the filibuster. There's lots of great work ongoing on different fronts there, but it does seem like every indication we've gotten so far is that all of these pieces could get through the Senate's budget reconciliation process. And Senator Bernie Sanders, who introduced it, is chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, and so has some amount of sway over that too. So this is something where obviously Republicans are welcome to support. Doesn't seem likely, but we need to get Democrats in line and making sure we're pushing for this.
Right, right. And Collin, who's standing in the way of eliminating fossil fuel subsidies? And also, are there false solutions being promoted? Well, I guess the big machine that'll suck carbon out of the air is a false solution.
That is one of the big ones, actually, and there's so many layers to this. But Jane, I don't think this answer will surprise you or many of your guests. The people standing in the way are the fossil fuel industry for the most part. And what they've done with so many of these subsidies, it's insidious, really. They claim, oh, we don't get any subsidies at all. They're trying to deny the reality in front of us. They're saying, oh, these aren't subsidies. They're just tax adjustments or things like this. Or, oh, that's been around for over 100 years. It can't possibly be a fossil fuel subsidy. That's exactly our problem. That's exactly what we're talking about, is the fact that the intangible drilling credit, which is a tax credit for fossil fuels, has been around for over 100 years. And it's such a part of the landscape that it just seems like it's part of the wall behind you, when in fact, it's a huge giveaway to the fossil fuel industry. So the people defending this are fossil fuel companies who, as I mentioned before, the money is important. I don't want to make people think it isn't. The money is very important. This is something that allows fossil fuel producers to continue to expand production, to drill new wells, to set up new markets for exports. That's another big global piece here. The money is important, but the political benefit is such a key part of these subsidies. And so they're really worried about losing their influence. Exxon and Chevron, the American Petroleum Institute, these are some of the major players who are sending teams and teams of lobbyists to meet with lawmakers. We've been meeting with people in the US House and Senate, and we'll come in with a couple of our NGO reps, our nonprofit lobbyists, and be talking to some of our congressional champions, and they'll say, yeah, the American Petroleum Institute came in last week and they brought a team of 20 onto a Zoom call. So they are scared to death that they're going to lose these huge handouts and giveaway. They're doing everything they can to try to peel off lawmakers on our side. And that's why the people power is going to be so important on our side, to fight back against those polluters who want this agenda to continue. Yeah. And so I think those are the main people standing in the way. On false solutions, as we mentioned, I think the most dangerous and insidious is this idea that fossil fuels can continue into the future if only we can remove the carbon in some way, which is dangerous on so many levels. It's incredibly expensive. The technology doesn't really exist yet, despite over a decade of trying to make it exist. It also ignores all the incredibly damaging impacts of the fossil fuel industry in exacerbating racism, in exacerbating environmental injustice, the local impacts of dredging a ship channel for exports, or drilling the heck out of a beautiful range in Colorado. There are so many disparate impacts of the fossil fuel industry that wouldn't be addressed when you're talking about just sucking the carbon out of the air, for instance, or capturing at a smokestack. And so I think fighting back against that narrative, pushing back and saying, no, this is actually about winding down the fossil fuel industry with a just transition. phasing this out in favor of the clean, renewable energy solutions and the different world that Jennifer started to talk about, like rearranging our entire worldview. And so I think that's what we have to be pushing instead of these false solutions, which would allow the same systems of inequality and inequity to continue.
Right on. Thanks for that.
Yeah.
Jennifer, you work with the Greenpeace offices around the world. What are some of the impacts of the fossil fuel industry in other countries? And what can Biden do? How does what he does fit into the picture?
Well, I'll start with that and then go into the impacts, because I think, today, to my horror, there was a new alliance announced at the summit, which was a doozy, which was, Colin, help me remember, it was the US, it was Canada, Norway, and
Saudi and Qatar.
Saudi Arabia and Qatar, which is about basically exactly what Colin was talking about, how to keep fossil fuels going while moving to net zero. And so you can see that this is the kind of cabal that's working together to keep fossil fuels on the horizon, ignoring all of these other impacts. And I think one of the most dangerous things I see a lot of right now is the idea that gas is okay. It's this bridging fuel, right? And I think your listeners should probably know this, but there's no time for gas anymore. We have to stop all gas infrastructure as well and move straight into renewables. And that's one of those tricky things that I've just seen so much work by the gas industry. They just stopped. Actually, there was a discussion in Europe, if you talk about other countries, about how to categorize sustainable solutions, and the gas industry managed to still be on the potential list. It's been delayed until the fall as potentially being sustainable. So it's just that's why people power is so important in all different parts of the world. And I think the impact, I would say, of the fossil fuel industry in other countries, in developing countries particularly, I would say there's kind of maybe two kinds. One is the macroeconomic impacts that are there, that extractive industries bring into developing countries. Those economies then often depend on low-paying jobs. There's little added value to the communities or even the countries, the majority of people in those countries, for the extraction of the fossil fuel and then actually the export of it to other countries. And so you have this great imbalance that's happening there of exploiting resources from poorer countries, often done by US, but other companies as well. And the other, of course, is the local impacts. Colin talked a bit about that. If you look at the numbers of people, and it comes in a number of different ways. It comes in the form of the local impacts of the actual extraction around communities, which is majority are in poorer communities around the world. It comes in the form of air pollution from coal, oil, and gas, which killed 8.7 million people globally in 2018 alone. And it also, so there's those health impacts as well as, of course, the contribution to climate change and the impacts that hit developing countries and the poorest countries the most. They are the ones that have not caused this problem at all, and yet are suffering from it. So those are some of the different impacts that are there, which don't exist with alternatives, which is why I think it's so important to be looking at shifting those. And as far as what the US can do, well, we have to move and have really a systems change about how we source our food, how we source our energy, and stop being dependent on resource-rich developing poor countries and importing and making them dependent and benefiting really the wealthy in those countries and the corporates in those countries for what we have in the US or in other developed countries. That means we need to look at our trade rules again. That means we need to look at how we source things as far as how we source our food and our energy. And that brings a lot of local benefits to communities on the ground. So it's a whole different mindset about how we live and work. It's totally possible. And I think that's what we need to expect from a Biden administration, to really show that new way of having equality across the board.
Yeah. Explain, I just heard that the United States is being asked to give money to Bolsonaro in Brazil to stop burning the Amazon. What is that about?
Well, it's potentially horrible. Anyone knows that the Bolsonaro government has been criminal in how it has fought against, stopped all laws, put a halt to laws to end deforestation, put indigenous peoples in great danger. And what the rumors are that are out there is that there are discussions ongoing between the US government and the Brazilian government to figure out how to get funds into Brazil from the US to stop deforestation. Sounds okay thus far, maybe, but the potential there is that the funds could come from the private sector, often from oil companies. If you look at just what Shell, as an example, says it's going to do in order to be net zero, it's all about planting trees and it's all about offsetting. So instead of, they can continue to pollute, they plant trees or they reduce deforestation so that they can continue to do what they want to do. And the scheme could be that there's funds that come in from, say, the fossil fuel industry to the Brazilian government to implement laws that they're now have kind of taken off the books. So and hundreds of groups from Brazil, indigenous peoples, have been calling on the Biden administration to stop those negotiations. I'm hopeful. I have to hope that that's what's happening, but people need to be aware. They need to join in solidarity and just make sure this doesn't happen.
Horrific.
Yeah.
So how does climate change and the fossil fuel industry affect communities in other countries, especially in the global South? And for listeners who may not be clear about what we mean by global South, we're talking about less developed countries, Africa, India, Central America, South America, countries that are not advanced industrially. How is it affecting those countries, those poor countries?
In many different ways. I mean, everything from, if you look at coal mining and how many people die in coal mining in places like South Africa, there's been hundreds that have died from accidents in coal mines. Looking at oil exploration and shale gas, not only in the US, obviously it's also relevant, but in developing countries where you have water impacts, both in the fact of access to water, but also the chemicals in the water themselves. You have land grabbing that happens for that exploration in developing countries also, I think, often in the US. In Argentina, you also have shale gas, for example, pushing aside other industries like wine growing in Argentina. So you have this move away and domination of local industries that occur. And of course you have the severe impacts of air pollution that come from the polluting of the production itself, and naturally the use of fossil fuels in the vehicles around the world, and the tens of millions that die from air pollution. Even just if you look at in 2020, there's a particulate matter 2.5, which is a very deadly air pollutant that was responsible for an estimated 160,000 lives in the world's 5 most populous cities, and cost of $85 billion in those cities. So whether it be at the well, whether it be in the land, whether it be in the air, it's not the way to go. It's very damaging, to say the least.
And of course, it's driving climate refugees. It's driving migration. An argument can be made that the majority of people at our own borders are fleeing drought and the violence that erupts when people can't eat and can't find food.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think, and I'll hand it over to Collin. I think that the impacts of climate change on the poorest, most vulnerable are extreme. And whether you see it in places like Honduras, whether you see it in Sudan, where often the droughts are the straw that breaks the camel's back, and then you have people fleeing. If you look at the potential for and the famine that is happening in the poorest countries as well from droughts and extreme weather events like was happening in Mozambique, the heat, I mean, and heat waves in places. So it's deadly. It's deadly.
Collin, then bring this same question back to us domestically. What impacts are the fossil fuel industry having on poor communities, BIPOC communities here in the US? Paint a picture for us.
Absolutely. It's something that is incredibly devastating to those with less political power in any place. And I think it is important to remember, we use terms like the global south. That makes a lot of sense. It makes it easy to kind of differentiate these things, but it does ignore some of the critical differences within countries, inequalities within regions. There are places in Africa which are much more susceptible to the impacts of climate change, for instance. And within Africa, that tends to be those who are poor, those who are less developed. That's also true within the US. You see the impacts of the fossil fuel industry falling so much more heavily on, as you mentioned, BIPOC communities, Indigenous communities, Black communities, Latino communities. These are the people who are suffering most from both the extraction end of the fossil fuel industry and then every other step in the chain. So from extraction and drilling all the way through pipelines and transportation of fossil fuels, to refining and processing of fossil fuels. Communities along the Gulf Coast, Cancer Alley is a place in Louisiana, which has just suffered unbelievably high rates of cancer, rates of various rare diseases, all of these things driven by refining, petrochemicals, the downstream impacts of the fossil fuel industry, and then by exports as well. I think exports is really something that ties together some of what we need to do here in the States with what Jennifer has been talking about. Exporting fossil fuels from the US is one way in which the US exports its products, continues to keep the rest of the world hooked on fossil fuels, is controlling a lot of the global energy agenda. But none of that falls under US emissions, which I think is really important to understand and really damaging. I actually helped write a report with some Greenpeace USA colleagues a couple of years ago, showing that even if the US mobilized to reduce our own emissions here at home at Green New Deal speeds, if we fully enacted AOC and Ed Markey's Green New Deal, but we didn't do anything to constrain production or to limit exports of fossil fuels, we would end up with still basically US fossil fuels would still be responsible for half of our current emissions in 2050. And so what we're doing is digging up these fossil fuels and now currently working to set in place systems of export so that we can export these fossil fuels from both LNG and crude oil are kind of the two biggest buckets here. LNG is liquefied natural gas. And we're setting ourselves up to export these to Asia, to Europe, to Africa, in agreements that will last 40, 50, 60 years, so far beyond when we know we need to be at net zero emissions. And we're continuing to build this infrastructure. So one of the most important things that President Biden needs to be pushed on hard is to end fossil fuel exports. There's an incredible campaign that launched in the States, in the US just this week, pushing Biden to do that, and led by people along the Gulf Coast who are most impacted by some of these projects. And I want to specifically highlight one project in a set of projects in South Texas, which is down near Brownsville, Texas. There were three proposed LNG export terminals down there, and they would disrupt the sacred burial grounds of the Carrizo Crudo tribe of Texas, the indigenous people of the area. It would have devastating impacts on the local economies, on shrimpers who have made their living for decades in this part of the Gulf Coast. And so there's been tremendous resistance as well, because stopping these projects is critical to stopping US expansion and stopping this idea that we can continue to export as many fossil fuels as we want. And so that's been an incredible fight, as I mentioned, led by the local people, led by local indigenous people, and they've succeeded in getting one of the two projects killed. There's still two remaining, but these are the sorts of fights that we have to be supporting, these LNG export fights, these crude oil export fights. And then the last piece I'll just add is it comes back to fossil fuel subsidies and finance too. US fossil finance and fossil subsidies are supporting projects that that are most impacting vulnerable peoples in the US and around the world. Jennifer mentioned Mozambique, and I think that's such a great example of a truly devastating fossil fuel extraction project and kind of fossil fuel build out by the fossil fuel industry. And that is being supported by US fossil finance, by fossil finance from Europe, by money from all of these developing nations flowing into this small underdeveloped country in Southern Africa, which is uniquely vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, heat waves and droughts, floods, and it's completely destabilizing the country. The human rights violations are just absolutely atrocious, and that's directly attributable to the US money flowing in and to private money flowing into these projects. And so that's what the Polluter Welfare Act is about. That's what our work here to stop fossil fuel build out is about, is preventing those violations where we can. And it's a whole nother conversation to talk about how we pay reparations, how we make it better, how we pay for loss and damage. But at a bare minimum, the first thing that we have to do is stop making the problem worse. We have to stop digging this hole deeper, stop the fossil fuel build out, and then work on it from there.
Boy, we have to put our bodies on the line and just do everything we possibly can to start with stopping subsidies and passing the Polluter Welfare Act. We're going to do it. Jennifer, what lessons have you learned from past global negotiations and meetings? How can people around the world take actions to hold leaders accountable during global moments like what's happening right now?
Oh, I think there's all kinds of ways. I mean, what I've learned is you have these global meetings. I mean, this one was extreme because it was all virtual, but normally you're in a place. And the thing to do is you bring the outside in, right? So there are these negotiations ongoing and you understand, okay, we know the US is blocking on something that's happening, or Japan is blocking on making sure that we cut all financing for fossil fuels. So what people can do is work with the NGOs in their countries, and through the media and through then pressure back home, you can work to shift the position of a country during a negotiation. It happens all the time. And I think what NGOs and media can do is really by activating back home. So by showing up on the steps of the Capitol back home, on showing up in front of the companies that are blocking something, by making sure that the media gets coverage, and then you can beam that into a global meeting and you can change a country's position. I've seen it happen many times through that kind of people power. It's super exciting and it works. And that's why it's so important to have these kinds of global networks and movements who work together, playing different kinds of roles on that side of things. I think people can also, we mentioned this issue of loss and damage. What is that? It's, those are the homes that are lost, the lives that are lost, the crops that are lost by climate change impacts now, and who pays for those? And I think what we're seeing around the world is people who are suing the largest companies, the climate majors, for actually those damages. So people can also join forces, and there's different organizations that can help in suing either governments. There's been successful cases that have happened in places like the Netherlands, or companies. There's many cases out there against fossil fuel companies for the damages that they're causing to their homes or to different cities. Those are just two kinds of examples of things that you can do in your everyday life. I mean, I think it's important to know you can do everything from, we just had a paraglider land on the roof of the European Central Bank to get them to pay attention and stop funding fossil fuels, but also to the dinner time conversations that people have with your families, and to organizing, webinars on fossil fuel extraction and solutions. So there's something all along the different chain that people can be doing. But these global moments, you can use them, you can change things in real time.
Thank you for all those handy tips. I know that there have been a lot of volunteer commitments from financial institutions to stop supporting fossil fuels. How important is that?
Yeah, thanks for raising that, Jane. That was been something that I've been quite worried about. There was an announcement yesterday by the Net Zero Banking Alliance. Sounds great. It's 43 banks, 23 countries, but it's voluntary and it's incredibly weak. And the problem is that you now have a series of voluntary corporate commitments for companies to go to net zero emissions, to go to zero. But the methodology on how to do it is very loose. It brings in a lot of these false solutions that Collin and has been talking about as well. And so in this instance, for example, there's no commitment to 1.5. There's no commitment to actually not financing coal, oil, or gas anymore. And so it's incredibly important that we need to get financial regulation. So we need to stop fossil fuel subsidies, but we also need financial regulation to get in place that requires companies to stop funding fossil fuels. It's not going to happen through voluntary commitments. And people will hear a lot of this, and banks, you know, the new head of Citibank was on yesterday talking about all of this stuff. I want to see her supporting financial regulation on the US Senate floor, and then I'll think that they're serious about climate change.
I didn't realize, but I just read today in the New York Times that the Biden administration could make it illegal for US companies to finance fossil fuels.
Absolutely, Jane. And that's exactly the sort of ambition that we need to see, and that we haven't seen at all so far. I think as Jennifer mentioned, we had those 43 banks come out yesterday and form this new Net Zero Asset Alliance. I don't know the exact overlap, but I think most of them are in this report that we just released just last month, showing that just in the 5 years since the Paris Agreement was signed, the world's 60 largest banks, which again, I think is most of those, have financed almost $4 trillion in new fossil fuel projects. So this idea that you're going to claim net zero in 2050, and probably not, the current crop of CEOs aren't even going to have to think about it during their time in office. It's just completely insane. So we need immediate action. We need, as mentioned, more than voluntary commitments. And you're totally right, Jane. This is something the Biden administration can do, has claimed in various interviews that they are thinking about doing, but this aggressive financial regulation, banning the financing of fossil fuels, active phase down plans for banks. This is something the US needs to be doing. The UK needs to be doing as well, the host of COP26. I think we're seeing the upcoming UN climate talks. I think we're seeing a lot of net zero commitments from banks and voluntary commitments from banks around COP26 as well. So I think disrupting that narrative, making it so clear that what we need is aggressive financial regulation and an end to fossil finance before we can even talk about how we think that banks should be involved in a green economy. We don't want to go from terrible big oil to terrible capitalist renewables either, but we have to stop that fossil finance as soon as possible with aggressive regulation.
Yeah. And it's something as well that people can do. Cut up your credit card. Don't give your money to Chase, for example, right? Or some of these other banks. Look at the list on the report and
tell them why you're doing it.
Exactly.
Tell them why Jane. I have a fond memory of, I think it was January 2020. It was one of the early Final Drill Fridays when it was in person in DC. And I was actually getting arrested inside a Chase Bank alongside Bill McKibben and Reverend Lennox Sherwood and other stuff. And then you led a delegation from the Capitol down the street and came and met us. And you were waving to us from outside the Chase Bank as we were locked down inside to talk to them about fossil finance. So I think that's the kind of pressure we need to be putting on these institutions.
That was the day I cut my Chase card up.
There you go.
I was at the World Economic Forum doing the same thing and taking them on there. So we're all connected.
Let's take some questions from the audience while we still have time. Maddie?
Yeah, we have some great questions. The first one is from Toby on Facebook, and this is a question for you, Jennifer. We are constantly being told that any action for the environment will cost jobs. How do we disrupt this narrative when our tax money is actually subsidizing all these supposedly great fossil fuel jobs and not green jobs?
Yeah, thanks, Toby. It's a great question. And I think that's one of the key tactics that those who want to stop progress use, scare tactics to say that we're just going to have economic hardship and lose jobs. I think there are two ways to disrupt it. I think the first is actually to get much more attention to the jobs that do exist and will exist more and more of in the green zero carbon economy. So whether those be in the renewable energy sector of everything from installing those solar panels to repairing them, whether that be in the retrofits of houses, very labor intensive work that's there. So getting those examples and those real stories. I think the other thing, which is a little bit connected into your question, is that for those people who are currently in jobs that need to transition out, that's where we can't leave any community behind. And that's where the just transition comes in, which is incredibly important to bring in the training, make sure that health benefits continue, make sure that all the pieces that are there. It's hard to replace communities, of course, but that's another key part of it. And I think having good examples of that there will actually build confidence and trust that organizations like Greenpeace, but others really mean it.
Great, thank you, Jennifer. From Alexia on Twitter, this is for you, Collin. Collin, we share the same problematic senator from Maine. She and her fellow Republicans have shown that even with massive public support, they are determined to do whatever they can to stop the Biden administration from making real progress. What is the answer here?
Great question. And if I had the answer, I'd probably be making a lot more money than I do right now, and we'd have a better world. But I do think that people power is such a key force here. Our senator from Maine, as mentioned, is very problematic. Even she, at times, has shown she's vulnerable to people power. And so I think the ways that we mobilize is so important for occasional Republicans, as mentioned, and also to make sure we have every Democrat on board, because again, it would be nice to have some Republicans. We don't need them to do this. Biden himself has the power to end a lot of fossil fuel subsidies by himself. And so I think there are going to be very key moments in the upcoming months when people power is so desperately needed. Some of that's going to be online actions as we come out of COVID, God willing. Some of it's going to be in-person actions potentially, but please keep your eye on social media, keep your eye on email lists. I know because I work closely with Greenpeace and Oil Change International, my org also has an email list. We're all going to be doing a lot of joint pushes to get members of Congress to support things like the Polluter Welfare Act, to get Biden to take executive action to end subsidies and finance for the fossil fuel industry. And then the last thing I mentioned, just that I think is important, and it's appropriate since Alexi sent this question in from Twitter, is I think the more that we can do to call out the fossil fuel industry's lies, to push back on the nonsense that we see spewing from the industry and a lot of the greenwashing, I think that's a really appropriate thing to be talking about just one day after Earth Day, a holiday that had such amazing original roots. Jane's seen the whole evolution, I think, of a holiday of resistance, really fighting back against corporations back at the beginning, and has now been so co-opted by corporations and so full of empty commitments and greenwashing nonsense. And so I think we're starting to see this happen, and we're starting to see articles written about it. We're starting to change the narrative when somebody like a fossil fuel company or the American Petroleum Institute or a big bank posts about their commitment to sustainability on Twitter. We're starting to see those mentions flooded. We're starting to see them be trolled by climate activists who are calling out their lies, who are calling out their bullshit. I think it's very important to toxify the fossil fuel industry in any way we can to make it clear what's actually happening here. And as Jennifer was talking about earlier, to call out the lies about gas being able to be seen as a bridge fuel, to make it very clear that it's a fossil fuel no matter what, to their lies that they don't get any subsidies, to make it very clear they do and we're coming for them. And so I think changing that overall mood is one of the things that is going to allow our representatives to feel more free to vote the way they know that they should, and to listen to us instead of the fossil fuel industry, because we're going to have more political power when we do that, and we're lessening the fossil fuel industry's political power.
Yeah.
Collin.
Can I add one quick little thing?
Of
Yeah,
course.
I just wanted to add in how important I think it is to connect this senator to the science that's happening in Maine and the impacts that are happening in Maine. If you look at the Gulf of Maine, if you look at the forests of Maine, if you look at everything that makes Mainers love Maine, they're at risk. And the costs of those risks are also extremely high. And I think there's so many amazing scientists and students in Maine that that senator needs to listen to much more than prioritizing fossil fuel industry.
Great point, Jennifer. Thanks. Do we have time for one more, Maddie?
I think we do. And this is a question for both of you, actually, but I think we can make that work. From Daphne on Twitter. Jennifer and Collin, what do you think has been the most successful climate action in the US or globally so far in the Biden era?
We've been on lockdown.
I think that's a great question. I mean, I think I'll go back to some of the stuff we said at the beginning, which is we've seen I think it's hard to think about a climate action in a sense of it's immediately done. We've seen some good announcements and processes start that are really important pieces of the puzzle. And the question is, what will the follow through look like? But I think on the finance side of things, we've seen a lot of momentum on ending international finance for fossil fuels, which again is hundreds of billions of dollars per year flowing to support the fossil fuel industry. And we've started to see that change. So just before the Biden administration, the European Investment Bank is a major institution that said it was going to end fossil finance. The United Kingdom has actually recently said that they are also ending fossil finance. Yesterday, during the Biden administration, we've been pushing really hard, and we got an initial statement from the Biden administration that they're going to be phasing out fossil finance. We haven't gotten there yet, but it's the dominoes are starting to fall, I think, on ending international finance for fossil fuels, which would have huge knock-on ongoing effects. I also want to just honor the years and years of activism and incredible resistance from indigenous communities, rural communities, everything that led to President Biden rejecting the Keystone XL pipeline on his first day in office. I think the significance of that cannot be understated. That is so incredibly important to those communities in the US, to indigenous resistors in Canada fighting the expansion of the tar sands oil industry. That was expected in some ways, but I think the culmination of a lot of activism, the proof that that activism and that resistance works, and a marker to the fossil fuel industry that things are going to be different now, that you're not going to get everything you want. We still need to keep fighting to make sure that that pattern continues, that President Biden stops other pipelines and enacts a just transition and cuts off these other handouts to the fossil fuel industry. But I do think the rejection of Keystone XL at the beginning was a really important way to set the tone for what is hopefully a big change from the past.
Great answer, Collin. Thank you. And thank you both, Jennifer, Collin. You have given us a tremendous amount of information that we need to absorb now. Thanks a lot for taking time to join us. And I know this has been a very intense, busy week. And for those of you in the audience, Jennifer is coming to us from Berlin. So it's like more than the end of the day there. I really appreciate your being here. You're both so well informed. Thanks. And I want to give one more reminder about next week's movie night on Thursday, April 29th at 5 p.m. Pacific. We'll be watching a special pre-release documentary that nobody has seen called Youth v. Gov, speaking of suing governments for not doing what they're supposed to be doing. It's the story of young people, really young people suing the government for violating their constitutional rights. After the show, we're going to have a Q&A with Phil Gregory, who's the lead counsel for the young people, and the filmmaker, Christy Cooper. So here's your last chance to drop a movie night drink recipe into the chat box. I can see there's already some pretty nice recipes there. We're going to choose one that I'll make. Movie night. Head over to firedrillfriday.com/movie night to sign up. Now, we've heard today how President Biden is on the right track, and it shouldn't go without acknowledging there's a lot more he can do, but we need to give him a pat on the back for what he's doing, which is certainly a lot more than we've had for a long, long time. And we need to continue pushing him and Congress to do more. We know that ending fossil fuel subsidies is a necessary step toward reducing our dependence on oil and our carbon emissions. And you can take action, please. We need you to take action. We don't want just to come together for talk and movie night and everything. We need to come together to take action. Send a message to your congressperson, urging them to pass the End Polluter Welfare Act. This act would end fossil fuel subsidies, Securing co-sponsors of the End Pollution Welfare Act puts our campaign in a strong negotiating position to truly eliminate subsidies this summer in the American Jobs Plan. So you know the drill. To make change, we need action. So go to fireDrillFriday.com/take action and contact your member of Congress today. We want them to hear from every person in the Fire Drill Friday community. Every single Friday until fossil fuel subsidies are a thing of the past. Please, it doesn't take long. Please do it. The more they hear from us, the more they will act. This works. It works. Both of our speakers today, Jennifer and Collin, have said people power works. And don't miss next week's show, which is going to be very interesting. I'm going to be talking with Senator Merkley. We're going to be talking about Biden's first 100 days as president and giving an assessment of what it looks like. Keep watching to see a short video at the end of today. When I say goodbye, stay on to watch a show called The Big Oil Cash Grab, featuring fossil fuel industry CEOs as contestants as they grab for taxpayer-funded handouts from inside a cash booth near the US Capitol. That should be fun. Have a beautiful weekend. And on the darker days, remember, we're winning. See you next time.
Welcome back to the Big Oil Cash Grab, the game show that brings on big oil CEOs to see how much fossil fuel subsidies they could possibly handle. We're talking about taxpayer cash. Let's recap. Before the commercial break, Exxon CEO walked off with $427 million in fossil fuel subsidies. And again, fossil fuel subsidies are anything that incentivizes fossil fuel production. It comes in the form of cheap drill permits, tax credits, tax deduction, basically any government support for the fossil fuel industry that would help increase their profits. Let's give a big cash grab welcome to our last contestant, Chevron CEO Michael Wirth. Come on up here, Michael. How you feeling today?
I feel great, John. It's April 15th, tax day, or as we like to call it, thanks, suckers.
There was a recent report that said that Chevron is the second biggest polluting company in the world. What do you have to say about that?
Second? Well, I know what I need to do. I'm going to instruct all of my private planes to fly in circles for 4 days straight. We want to be number one, baby!
This guy will say literally anything on TV, but we can't wait to see it in the cash booth.
Yeah, speaking of which, John, for the last couple of years, there's been a little bit too many 5s and 10s. I hope you fixed the problem, if you know what I mean.
We have fixed the problem. Wow, that is one greedy CEO here on the Big Oil Cash Grab. I think he's literally trying to eat the money inside the booth. Wow, he's stuffing it in. How many pockets does this dude have? Unbelievable. Literally stuffing billions of dollars of taxpayer cash in his pocket. Well, it looks like Big Oil won again today. And that's all the time we have here today on the Big Oil Cash Grab. While this looks like an old school show, this is an ongoing problem. The fossil fuel industry benefits from $15 billion in direct fossil fuel subsidies every year, and it doesn't have to be that way. This is your hard-earned tax dollars at work going right to the big oil companies. Call on your member of Congress to commit to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies, co-sponsor the End Polluter Welfare Act, and end fossil fuel subsidies once and for all in the American Jobs Plan.
Yeah!